Okay, so let's dive into politics of death in the past, and we're going to look at a few particular cases of transformations that occur after death in pre-Hispanic societies in particular. What I mean when I talk about these transformations then are how are the dead incorporated into society? How do people interact with the dead months, years after the individual has died? And this commonly occurs among pre-Hispanic societies as visual displays of human remains. The most famous of which are zoopontles, which is the term we use for skull racks. It's a particular form of transformation after death. This involves the display of heads from human sacrifice. Now, there are variations of this practice throughout Mesoamerica, ranging from 700s through 1500s CE. For example, within the Aztec Empire, which you can see its geographic extent depicted here in the map, it was a very common practice. We know a lot about this because of the excavations done at the Templo Mayor complex at Tenochtitlan, which is now under nowadays modern Mexico City, specifically the Zocalo, right in the heart of the city. Now, the Zoopontli themselves were central to Aztec as well as Mixtec cosmology, and we know this because there are several codices, similar to what you see here on the left, that are pictorial representations of what behaviors and acts were observed by early conquistadors and the people who traveled with them. Also, sometimes translations of different words, various ways of learning about the past through this sort of ethnographic, ethnohistoric records and documentation. What we see and we understand based on those documentary sources then are that the gods sacrificed themselves to create humanity, as well as sacrifice as a debt for repayment. So through various ceremonies, there are, the sacrifice of sometimes hundreds of captives as a reenactment of the forming of the Aztec cosmos. The heads themselves then are processed by specialists and tend to be ritually displayed later on, such as what you can see here. Now this is actually a stone carving. It's a reconstruction of a stone skull rack that was depicted at the Templo Mayor. This, on the other hand, is a sort of artist reconstruction of what this Zoopontli might have looked like. According to conquistadors' accounts, there were over 100,000 skulls on display within this particular skull rack. In reality, maybe more like in the range of thousands, but if we want to over-exaggerate, this is maybe what it would have looked like. The excavations themselves, as I mentioned, take place in the Zocalo area of Mexico City. It's also called the Plaza of the Tres Culturas. So we have the Aztecs, early historic church, cathedral in there, and then the modern day presidential palace is right in this same place. You can see all three cultures, depending on what angle you're looking at within the Zocalo. There are still ongoing excavations within this area of the city, specifically along República de Guatemala, along the backside here, as well as isotopic studies that will eventually inform us on paleomobility and the diet of sacrificial victims. So why was there sacrifice, and why did Mesoamerican people display human remains? Well, it's a part of their shared belief in this sort of tripartite cosmology. The cosmos were above, there was the earthly realm or the earthly plane where they lived, and then the watery underworld. So this habitual practice was part of their world making in terms of structuring of ceremonial centers that reflects the cosmos themselves. It was a way of world centering through the communication with the ancestors of the deities, the deification of different rulers, giving reverence for royal lineages. And it was also world renewing. So through these ritual practices, through sacrifice and tracking of calendrical systems, they made sure that the sun was going to come up again the next day. Now let's go to one of my favorite Mesoamerican sites, which is La Quemada, where I did my dissertation research. You can see here, this is from the sort of monumental core area of the site, looking out. There's a big votive pyramid down here. This is actually a very long ball court, eye-shaped ball court that you can see in the middle ground. And then this, way out in the distance, is what we call the Hall of Columns, and there's evidence of this having been, sort of covered structure with bodies hanging on display within it. We see concentrations of the bones that have kind of just would have fallen to the ground after, the site fell into disuse. I think I showed you some of these in a slide similar to this in a previous module, but the site of La Quemada is located down here in Zacatecas, Mexico. The relative dates are 600 to 900 CE, although we're maybe even shortening that nowadays to 600 to 800 CE. And the area where my dissertation advisor did a lot of excavation was this multi-room sort of multi-household residential unit. Now, it was unique in that there was a causeway entrance coming through here, so people would have come and gone to the site along this pathway. And the most important, at least for today's discussion, room in this area is this room 1, which we also refer to as the temple. And that's because we saw the display of human remains that by the time archaeologists came in had, fallen from where they were hanging as bundles to the ground. We can see evidence of the reverence that was given to them. These bones were touched over and over again. It leaves like the oils from people's hands on them, creating this specific type of patina. Processing of human remains, so the end of the long bones are treated in particular ways. We even see evidence at La Quemada of what's called pot polish, and that's the sort of markings or patterns that are left from when bones are cooked for a long period of time. So also the potential for cannibalism in the past. Another big important site within Mesoamerica is the site of Teotihuacan. This is the moon pyramid we're seeing here on the far end of the Avenue of the Dead, which is this long roadway right down the middle of the site. You can see it depicted here in yellow, the moon pyramid on the north end, the sun pyramid, which is one of the largest ones in Mesoamerica, in the middle, and then the feathered serpent pyramid, which was located in the Ciudadela, down on the south end of the Avenue of the Dead. Now, this was a massive urban center. You can see all the different buildings on the map here, even though you don't always see those with the naked eye on the landscape today. It's located about 30 miles northeast of Mexico City, and its occupation spans about 200 BCE to 550 CE. Now, there's no language, unlike Nahuatl that we have for the Aztecs. There's no codices like we have for the Aztecs case, so our descriptions of their worldview are dependent pretty much primarily on the archaeology itself. So a good example of this then is the moon pyramid, which was constructed in distinct phases. Archaeologists excavated a very long, 345-meter long tunnel from the south end to the north end through the middle of the pyramid. And they found that it was actually constructed and sort of reorganized over time as 7 superimposed structures. And each time there was a remodeling event that happened, there were different statements being made with different dedicatory offerings at different times. So let's take a look at a few of those. Burial 2 was this central figure here is actually a seated individual, which is not the typical pattern we see within Teotihuacan. We see the presence of Tlaloc vessels, so these are particularly formed, a special form of ceramic vessel, and they have what's called these googly eyes on them, and that's the sort of depiction of the rain deity or the storm god. We have the remains of eagles in this burial, a falcon, owl, wolves, and 2 pumas. So pretty unique fauna assemblage in terms of what's being buried with this particular individual, as well as an array of sacrificial knives. So these are obsidian blades that you see sort of intermixed here with some figurines as well. In burial 3, there were actually 4 individuals who were bound with ropes. We know this because their hands are, you can see clasped behind their back, not a typical position you would see for more of a reverential sort of burial. One of these individuals was wearing a necklace made out of human maxilla, so that's the jawbones. There are shell trumpets, which are a very ritually symbolic object in Mesoamerica, and those are found in the four corners here. Caches of projectile points. Really, overall, just the sort of careful placement of artifacts at regularly spaced locations. So, very, very intentionally organized burial. In burial 4, what we find are actually 17 severed heads. They're primarily male. All of them are associated with the cervical vertebrae still there, some containing the actual cut marks themselves, which is where they would have done the decapitation during the ritual sacrifice. There's a diversity in the age of individuals represented. Also, cranial modification, so that's actually changing the shape of someone's skull. You can see an example here, maybe like the sort of two-lobed kind of structure versus more of these like pointed, sort of strange, profiled cranial modifications. Some of them have tooth inlay, so modification of their teeth, which would have involved putting turquoise or other sort of colored rocks into their actual teeth. Overall, this is very suggestive of various ethnic groups or social statuses within the same burial. Burial 6. This proclaims some sort of political or religious power. That's because we see 12 adult males who are actually sacrificed with this person. Their arms are tied behind their backs. 10 of them are missing their heads, so perhaps these are the bodies that go with some of the heads we found in the previous burial. There are also animals that were sacrificed, 2 canines, 4 felines, 14 complete bird skeletons. Again, one individual is wearing another one of these maxilla necklaces, and several obsidian and blades. So what this evidence shows us is that human sacrifice was happening on a smaller scale, perhaps, than what we see in the Aztec Empire, but it was still a prevalent practice at Teotihuacan, which predates the Aztec Empire. Interpretations involve, its association with the political authority, or maybe even the reproduction of the cosmology. Overall, death was seen as this transformation into a symbol of the state-level authority. It confers their cosmological power and the structures and institutions that would have been in place to support that. Now, who were these sacrificial victims? Well, they tend to vary in age, sex, ethnicity, social status, and origins, meaning, where did they come from originally? They're typically separated by identity within different burials, so we see soldiers sort of grouped together, non-local individuals are put into separate dedicatory offerings. These sacrificial burials or offerings represent different themes or statements on state-level authority. Some of these were clearly more cosmological and others are more political. But the ongoing isotopic research that's being done will eventually help us to track what's called paleomobility of ancient populations. One particularly good example of that is research being done down in the Wari Empire in South America. Now, this is the pre-Hispanic Andes of Peru, the cultures dating from 600 to 1000 CE. And there's a very long tradition there of taking and displaying or using human body parts amongst, in particular, the cultures of the Moche and the Inca. There we see what are called trophy heads, and those are these little puncture marks that you see in the top of the skull, and then that would have been used to actually hang the heads within the sites themselves, or to be used in different ritual ceremonies. You can see the heads depicted here being held by deities or religious specialists. It's hard to know for sure. Who were they? There have been several interpretations, vanquished enemies, revered ancestors, executed criminals, or even trade items or heirlooms themselves. To get at answers to these sorts of questions, researchers are engaged in what's called radiogenic strontium, or isotopic analyses, and paleomobility. And so what that allows them to do is track where people grew up versus where their remains are recovered. So as we go through our lives, our bodies are constantly absorbing all different sorts of elements and minerals from the water we drink and the foods we consume. And we're able to then study the bones from different parts of people's bodies to understand and track their migration patterns or where they originally came from. In the case of the Wari Empire, we're seeing evidence then that suggests a mix of local and non-local individuals who actually compose the trophy heads themselves. And here we can see just a few more representations amongst the Nazca culture, which comes a little bit later, on the pottery itself, stone sculptures, as well as, the trophy heads themselves.